everyone. Um, Bear with me as I record this first demo for this class in my kind of makeshift dining room studio. I don't completely feel very comfortable going into my own studio space, which I do have in a warehouse. I have temporarily kind of made a little studio spot for, the living room just kind of became a studio space. I wish I could give you a 360 degree view, but there are a lot of wires coming out of this phone right now. So maybe I'll do so after I'm done. So the demo today will be dealing with how to paint white and transparent objects using watercolor. If you see here, I do have a wine glass with some water and also a white cup, and I put used to be white, a little bit not so white anymore, off-white fabric underneath. Okay. I have a small kind of a board where I can tape up, so I taped up my sheet of paper. So for this, I'll be using the cold press paper, and so I taped it up with masking tape. And as I told you the first day of class, for me it's a lot easier for me to sketch things out either at an angle or vertically, because when I am looking at it like this, it's quite difficult for me to get perspective and symmetry correctly. If you are working flat, at least for the sketching process, I would probably suggest that you stand up so you have a bit more distance when you're looking, because the angle gets skewed a lot more when you're looking this way when you're sitting down and the surface is flat. Okay, so I am going to just really quickly sketch this out. I don't want trying not to make this too long, so you don't get too bored. One thing that I did forget to say during the first class is that unlike oil and acrylic painting classes you would have taken before, where we normally don't really sketch things out necessarily with pencil, we more kind of build it with your paint, or you use very thinned out paint with solvent to mark areas. For watercolor, we do usually, unless you feel like you don't want to, or you're doing a very specific work with a lot more amorphous, or you have a lot of really great control, we do very lightly sketch things out also, mostly because one thing that's opposite of watercolor from oils and acrylics is the fact that you can't really fix it once you have laid on the paint, right? Because it's not the type of medium you can just continuously paint over, and because the whole point of watercolor is the fact that it's translucent and transparent, that the idea of covering over a mistake is not really something you can do very easily. So I'm just going to kind of mark very lightly. So for this, I am using 2B. Personally, that's my favorite kind of sketching pencil. Make sure when you're working with objects, they're symmetrical. Make sure you measure right from the middle, the right, and the left, so we can make sure that things are even. Okay. And I have some really great kind of light and dark happening. Do you see that in that glass? So this should be pretty fun. I also try to, I put large pieces of drawing paper for me, mostly so I don't get kind of paint all over, but it also so that I'm not having too many distractions in the background for this. Okay. And one thing you can do, and make sure you do this lightly, like don't press too hard. Another thing about watercolor is if you press too hard with your pencil, remember we were taught not to do that also in drawing class because it will leave an indentation. It's the same thing for watercolor. Not only will it be kind of very impossible to kind of erase the marks, if you press on it too hard, you'll also kind of be able to see that indentation when you paint over it, okay? So just be mindful of that, okay? What I'm gonna also do is I'm gonna just lightly mark the areas for this glass that's really kind of dark, right? And for watercolor, I mean, there's a reason why a lot of people also sometimes might refer it to as drawing at times, because there is something very drawing-like about the process. And here I'm going to actually put a white mug that's over there next to it. When you're doing your small paintings, you don't necessarily have to add multiple objects. You can focus on a single object if you would like, but kind of really think about the composition, right? So think about the whole page as a whole, how big you're making your object, right? And where you're placing it, or are you including the surface, right? Or a table that's in it, or are you including like a little remnant of there being a light source? So kind of thinking about it as you're making a whole painting instead of just painting, thinking about it as just an object, because it does say have a very different feel. For example, if you're to have a very large piece of paper and a tiny object, right? There's a very specific sensibility with that. Or when you have a small page and then you fill it up, right, with the image. So they both have very kind of different just overall feel to how they are. So think about those things when you're placing your objects, right? And again, they don't necessarily just have to be one singular thing in the middle, even though we are focusing on singular objects, different types of objects, I should say, for the first kind of couple of weeks of the course, okay? And also note that it's totally fine to cut things off the page, if you would like, or if that helps you create a stronger composition. So you may notice that the cold press could be slightly different feel than the paper you're used to. Again, also when you're erasing, don't erase too hard because that messes up with the fiber of the paper. Okay, so I just have like some kind of light marks. So I'm going to create a little fold just to give it a bit more, something to tie the whole composition, right, together. Okay, so I decided this is kind of going to be, my sketch to start out with. But for me, so kind of think about making it so that it's not too bottom heavy or top heavy, okay? And in my case, I'm just gonna, add a little bit more, a little line for my table over there. Okay. So now I have that. Normally I would also paint at a slight angle, but once I have kind of the general form, for this size, it's also perfectly fine to paint on a flat surface. And hoping that you can see it better that way, I will kind of do it that way. And I'm just realizing that you might be seeing the whole thing sideways. So why don't I just try to see if I can tilt this up. Like that. Oh yeah, okay. Hopefully that would work better. And thank you for bearing with me as I learned new technology. And I promise I will kind of master this by the end of the semester. Okay. So the question, so we talked about how do we create white objects, right? But using watercolor, you don't have white. But you may remember from some of the previous painting classes you've taken, just because an object is white doesn't mean we only use black or white and black straight from the tube, right? There are plenty of kind of tinted grays that you can use, and that's the idea we're going for, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with this white object, and Lisa brought up a good suggestion last time about kind of wetting the paper first. Cold pressed paper works really great for that. So what I'm gonna start out with the inside of this mug. So I just kind of wet it. So the way you control the brush is also important. As I said, I like to use kind of the side, kind of bigger stroke, but also kind of practice how you kind of pull that into something a little tighter, okay? What I would avoid is painting like this with your brush, or painting like this with your brush until the very end. You can do it as kind of a way to make certain details pop out. So for things that are kind of gray, oftentimes people either go in the cooler area with kind of the blues and the greens, or the warmer tone of like the browns and the ochres. So we'll see kind of what that does. But for today, for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of mix the two together to get into a more muted, kind of a gray. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a bit of the olive green, and then a bit of kind of this viridian green or phthalo green, and then a little bit of this blue. So I actually laid out the palette for myself too. It should be in the same order. Okay. All right, and then that color, one thing you can do is I'm just gonna use a scrap paper right here so you can see. So that color over here is, kind of is a really nice bluish, kind of muted greenish color. This works really good, really well for glass textures. To this, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a bit of a warmer tone because it's a little cold. So let's add a bit of this brown. But this is a pretty intense color. So what I might suggest is that you go in there and maybe add a little bit more of an indigo to offset that tone. And do you see how we're kind of getting closer to like what we consider as this kind of muted gray? And as long as it's diluted enough and muted, that's the thing. So make sure it's not so heavily saturated with a single color. Make sure you kind of mix different colors together to get the type that's kind of muted tone that you're looking for, okay? So now that we have our paper that's a little wet, what I'm gonna do is, and don't be afraid to get a bit, bit dark, or what feels kind of darker or more saturated, okay? Because it will dry a bit lighter, okay? Okay, so now on the wet part, I went a little darker right here, so it kind of is blending out nicely. And while it is still wet, what you probably want to do is make a, similar color, but with more pigments. So do you see what I'm doing? So I'm just adding more of the paint, even though it's still enough water to kind of move it around easily and squeeze out the water. And just very gently and strategically just kind of mark an area, and then if you want to pull that color out, just squeeze some water out from your brush and pull that out. Okay. All right. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. My light right now is coming, more from my right side because I'm seeing shadows on the left side, and it's a little darker on this side as well. So again, I'm gonna kind of wet this portion, and if you want to go a bit more kind of a floral and more colorful, you can totally do that. Just make sure you mute it. You can even do it as kind of a muted purple. One thing you can do is just mix in a little bit of the complementary color, okay? Because that kind of mutes down your colors, okay? So for example, I just made kind of like a purplish tone, and I just add that for the area that's should be the darkest. One thing we don't want is it being so fussy that everything looks like just like tiny little brush strokes and it was so tight. Because one thing that's beautiful about watercolor is kind of this more parts that are tighter, parts that are a bit more expressive. So I'm like using the side of my brush, as you see, just to make it kind of this one swooping line here. With things that are especially like indigo blue at the very end, that's a really nicely muted blue. If you want to mix that in with a little bit of either umber or sienna, like that makes a gorgeous, gorgeous gray right there. Do you see that? So again, remember the general to specific rule. So kind of lay out the values, first don't overwork it. That's what kills watercolor, is if you overwork areas, okay? But do you see how beautifully gray that is? If you're going for that kind of straight up gray look, okay? So now once I have like my general value, then I can go back, and it works nicely if you do it while it's still wet. I'm gonna go in and add parts that are a little darker. Okay. So Scott had a good question of which direction do I start, like darker or lighter. My own habit is like I kind of start from the darker part and move to the lighter part, and then I move back into the darker part. So it's kind of this idea of working back and forth because I'm constantly adjusting what needs to be lighter and what needs to be a bit darker. Part like this, it doesn't bother me just because I think it looks kind of cool. But if it does bother you, you can easily have a clean brush, kind of take all the water out and pick up that color if you like. So this, it will never go back to original white like the paper if you're picking up, so for example, like what I'm doing right there, original color, but it can lighten, you are able to pick up some pigment to make it a little lighter, okay? And I'm trying to see if I can make it focus a little better. Okay, so let's go into our wine glass, and I have my kind of lip right here. Okay, same thing. So what I'm gonna do is, so something about glass texture, it's all about the contrast of light and dark, right? And then defining that kind of depth and the lip of the wine glass. Okay, so for me, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna generally kind of lay out the shape really lightly, but not outline it, right? So I'm kind of marking, okay, the inside area, the part I see as dark is right here. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of, it's almost like just tinted water, right? At first, think of that. And for me, I'm gonna start adding a bit of brown into this just because of a reflection of my board. It's giving it quite a bit of a kind of warmer tone from what I am seeing. So I have this kind of neutral parts. And for glass, for parts that are dark, do not be afraid to go pretty dark, okay? All right, so I'm just kind of, starting to kind of build this form. And then one thing we don't want to do is just go bing and then outline the whole thing without any kind of line variation. Okay, so one thing you can do is, okay, here's a part that you can, I made a little tight. And then from there, just put a little more water on your brush and pull that out, right? So now we're kind of creating contrast, but also a sense of form. Okay, so now we're going to start to see a general form of this glass, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, because when I see the dark parts of this part is basically as dark as the inside of that mug. So I am putting in a bit of indigo, a little bit of both of the browns. It's like a little tap, is fine. We don't really need a big goop like we do with oils or acrylic. Okay, so I'm gonna give it a little contrast over here because it is quite contrasted. And parts like this is what's going to make your glass look kind of grounded and not floating and just airy, because there are parts, the darks are really dark in objects that are transparent like glass. And then that's all about saturation, right? But make sure it's never so saturated with no water that when you are painting that it looks completely looks dry. Okay. I feel like I should be playing music as I'm painting. Maybe I will try that for the next demo next week. Okay. Then I see quite a bit of reflection here, or what I'm seeing through in my house. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add kind of this brownish tone because that is what I see. And for most of you, if you fill up your glass with water, this water will have this really beautiful details you can paint. So here at the top, like really think about how that water meets the glass, right? But again, we want to leave enough spaces, kind of um, not super overworked, right? You know, it's fine to kind of go over and maybe give it a little bit of just, you know, just a bit of water just to add to a little bit of color if you want. But don't put too much detail all over because it could look a little suffocating. Okay. And then here I'm gonna go back into the dark, right? And kind of add a bit. So like here I feel like I got a little too dark. So again, what I'm doing is I'm going and just lifting that water really quickly. Okay. And then don't forget about the depth, the thickness of the glass itself. So for example, I'm gonna actually use something a little colder. I added a little bit of cold green into what I was using. And at the very edge, that got a little dark. It's a little dark on the glass. And same thing here. Okay. And over here, towards the very edge at the top, it's quite dark as well. So like on one side for me, the thickness of the glass looks darker, and then the other side looks lighter. But again, don't feel like you have to put in every single detail that you see. Sometimes kind of working from objects you see, you do have to abstract and simplify a bit, okay? Unless your goal is to do something that's completely photorealistic. And for something like glass, the important part has to do with how you deal with the background. Because that's what can make it really stand out. And here, I'm just going to add a bit more details here, because there are a lot of kind of dark contrasts that I see. Okay. And in the, but I use a color that's slightly different. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dab a few of that color up here just so that it's it feels unified, right? To have this kind of color balance. But I'm going to lift some of that up. And I'm going to kind of revisit with this color into the mug. Again, just so that we're having, we probably remember color unity. It's kind of important to have something that kind of ties the whole composition together. Through kind of repetition of the same tones or colors. And as you're doing it, make sure you don't forget about your shadows. That's important. So here I have shadows. And then shadows from the objects could be used in a very strategic way to and here, so I made something dark, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply, after that I have my brush with some water. I kind of pulled it out, so now it's going to just kind of blend nicely in there. Okay. All right. And then here it's a little darker, quite a bit darker. All right. And now I'm just gonna balance it out a little bit to make it a little glossier. And for me, like behind the water is like slightly darker. So don't be afraid to use kind of bigger strokes like this. Okay. I'm just gonna kind of show you a bit of a fabric part. So I just see these kind of few big rolls of fabric. So I kind of wet the paper and then I went on there to make it a little, just give it a little volume and shape. And what you can do is, so for me that looks a little warm. It's a little warmer, that cloth. So I'm gonna add parts that are a little bit warmer, like a little bit of ochre in there. So just to kind of give it a bit of like a warmer tone. I'm gonna actually define the fold almost by defining the shadow underneath first. And again, I want to stress that this is the way I do watercolor, right? And the way I was trained and then practice on my own. But by no means is it the only way to do it. So if you find a better way that works for you, you're more than welcome to use that. Okay. But now I feel like it's getting a little boring in here. It's a little too monochromatic. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I kind of feel like throwing in a little bit of just kind of muted, kind of purplish tone. So let's do that. Ooh, do you see how that just like kind of, we still read this as like a white object. It just gives it a little bit more of like a visual interest, right? Okay. And again, inside of here is quite dark. So I'm gonna wet that a bit first. I'm gonna mix a little bit of the indigo blue and then some Van Dyke brown. So the trick with white objects is like, don't be afraid to get super dark on the dark parts, but at the same time, don't be like, you have to be very strategic where you put the dark, right? So for me already, when I'm like looking at it, I kind of feel like, parts of here could have been a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to like go adjust. Do you see how just like lifting a tiny bit over here just like brightens the whole glass? Okay. Yeah, I like that right there. And then I can go into, make a bit of darker color, squeeze out my water, and then go in there now. And again, I am defining the inside space by defining the shadow. And here, same thing. again, I'm gonna have, so the shadow over here, it's pretty thin, but it's quite strong. So I'm gonna go in here, and this is also one great way where you can, here, then I'm picking up some color from here. Great way where you can use the shadows to define the other folds. And I love when something like this happens, right? Where it just looks so effortlessly kind of blended out, okay? I think that's one beauty about watercolor. The parts that almost look like, and often are, kind of happy accidents, right? So people say it's hard to control watercolor. It's true, but sometimes it's about controlling it so that it doesn't look like it is being controlled. That's also really important to think about. Okay. All right. So I'm going to end this demo kind of now because it's a long demo for a video. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna quickly finish, or not quickly, probably quickly, finish this painting, and I'll upload the final result and untape this so you can kind of see the bordering effect that it got. Okay. All right. I'm turning it off now.